I'm going to start out by reprising something I talked about here, I think 3 years ago. And I will show you that to start out with. This is a graph of labor force participation of men, graphed up to 2013, and just look at the bottom line, age 65 to 69-year-olds, and what you see there is obviously rising participation and a very substantially rising participation. And for women, a similar rise and in participation, and so everything looked like it's all going up. I also presented data on the subjective probability of working past age 62 or 65 from the HRS. The question format is the one that you see there. What are the chances you will be working full-time after you reach age 62, and a follow-up age 65. I'll call those things P62 and P65. Those have been shown to be quite predictive of actual labor force participation or work after 62 and 65. Both in the aggregate over time and also at the individual level, following the same people over time and seeing what actually happens to them. And so we've used those in a number of ways because of the predictive power of that. And here, taken from that same presentation, are the average subjective probability of working past age 65 for male workers. And say, looking at any of those age bands, say the orange 57 to 58, rising over time. This was asked of male workers age 57 to 58 in 1992 in the HRS, in 1994 in the HRS. That's what's on the horizontal axis, so that's the year in which this was asked. And so you're seeing increasing expectations of working past age 62 or 65 over time. That kind of predicts, and did predict, the actual increases in participation that we observed in the data. And I also noted, similar for female workers, but at the time I noted kind of a disturbing trend in health, which we know is an important determinant of labor force participation. As you see here, looking at the 4 left bars, this is the fraction of the population in fair or poor health among men in 1992, 98, 2004, and 2010, and this is the population age 51 to 56. In 1992, the fraction in fair or poor health was around 17%. By 2010, the fraction in fair or poor health had risen to 23%. Well, that's kind of a disturbing trend. Everything is getting better, but health is not getting better for women, a slightly modified version of the same thing. On the right are ADL limitations in the activities of daily living for men and women. There, the trend is fairly clear for women, less clear for men. Nonetheless, a question that came to my mind and I posed at the time was, how do we reconcile the increase in participation with this apparent worsening of health? And at that time, I concluded, looking at the P65 and P62, predicted an increase in participation rates. As you see here, let's look at the 65 to 69-year-olds. In 2006, it was around 30%, and I predicted by 2023, based upon these subjective probabilities, an increase of to 38% or an 8.1 percentage point change. So that's what I talked about here 3 years ago. And the objective of the paper that we're working on now, and I'm going to talk about today, is a closer examination of these trends, both in actual labor force participation and subjective probability of working and health, to try to understand better these trends along with the worsening of health that we saw. So now I'm going to add several more years from the CPS to the trends that I just showed you. And this is for males, looking at the bottom line, age 65 to 69, it's sort of not clear anymore of an upward trend. It kind of looks like things flattened out beginning and around in 2009, and not much upward trend. For women, maybe slightly upward trend, but hardly startling or what we would have seen before. If you look at first differences, it becomes even more apparent that the trend, at least recently, has ceased. We see For males, age 65 to 69, beginning in about 1995 or thereabouts, increases of about 0.6 percentage points per year. And that persisted up to 2009. The Great Recession dropped. And then for the past 5 or 6 years, basically no increase in participation or very little increase in participation. For women, a similar graph may be shifted slightly. So looking at first differences makes a little bit more clear what the graphs themselves showed is, at least in recent historical data, the increase in participation has ceased. If we then look at P65, the subjective probability of working past age 65 with an additional HRS wave, this is for workers, male and female. For males, that also peaked in 2008, has now been flat, and for females also. So the rather optimistic tone in participation of 3 years ago is not nearly as optimistic. And the objective here is to study the relationship between health and retirement as measured by the subjective probability of working, to try to understand better what has happened here since the last time I talked about this. Our main vehicle is the subjective probability of working past age 65, which I call P65. A weakness of P65 in the HRS data is that it was not asked of non-workers, I should say, prior to 2006. It was asked of workers always from 1992 to the present, but not of non-workers between 1992 and 2004. So it's missing some waves. However, something we call P-work was asked of non-workers from 1994 to the present. What are the chances that you will be working for pay at some time in the future? So people not in the labor force were asked that. And so what we do to construct P65 for non-workers is to estimate the relationship between P65 and P-work from 2006 to 2014, where we have data on both things for the same people, and then predict that prior to 2006 for non-workers. The relationship is very strong between P-work and P65. You can see the coefficient is 0.46 with a standard error of 0.02 for males and 0.45 for females. So construct fitted values of P65 for non-workers prior to 2006 so we can look at the entire population, not just the selected population into employment. And here's what this looks like for males going back, aggregating 1994 to 2004 data as a function of age. And what you see is that P65 for males is sort of flat by age 51 up to 59. For non-workers, it declines over time, reflecting the reduced likelihood of getting back into the labor force as people advance into ages in their late 50s. So the P-work, this is really driven by P-work, declining P-work among people who are in their late 50s. Small probabilities of getting back into the labor force. These would be numbers like 0.10 of working at some time in the future once people are not in the labor force. For males, females, a similar graph, and you can see at age 59, the probability that somebody not in the labor force will be working after age 65 is just about 6%. So very few people re-enter, at least according to this measure. And now if we put these together for workers and non-workers age 55 to 59 across the HRS waves, wave 2 is 1994 and wave 12 is 2014. What you see basically for everybody is a peak in wave 9, which was 2008, the height of the, just before the Great Recession, and then more or less a flat line after that. So this is different from what I showed before because what I showed before was just for workers. This is for everybody. You might see a slight uptick there for females, but this is hardly the big upturn or big increase that we see going back to 1994 when the average was 20%, reaching 32% and now basically flat since then. This is in the interpretation of this is actual labor force participation, so predicting in 1994 a 20% participation rate at age 65, rising to 33%. So very large increases in participation were predicted by P65, but nothing since then. Well, what are the explanations for the flattening of P65 since the Great Recession? Obviously, the Great Recession had an effect on this. We see that pretty clearly with the flattening out that occurred then, and this should remind us, which I did not put on the slide, that other things are going on besides health. The focus of what I'm going to talk about here is health, but clearly there are other things that are going on, although one would think by now, we are now 9 years out from the Great Recession, or 8 years out, that we should be back in some sort of equilibrium, but possibly we're still not. But the focus of what I will talk about today is the relationship between health, and particularly self-rated health, and P65. And to do that, we conduct a cohort analysis. So here is the percent of population with self-rated health, ages 55 to 59, and the HRS, waves 2 to 12, again, 1994 to 2014. And I've divided it into three groups. Those excellent, very good, and research has shown that there's a gradient between those two, but the difference between excellent and very good is not enormous compared to the other self-rated health categories. So excellent and very good are combined. That's the blue line, and fair or poor are combined. That's the yellow line. The missing line is good, the one in the middle. It's a 5-point scale. And what you see is a slight decline in the fraction of the population assessing its health as excellent, very good, and a slight increase in the population assessing its health as fair or poor. These are not enormous changes, but they certainly do not indicate improving health. As we saw earlier, for example, the percent excellent, very good declined by 0.38 percentage points per wave. A wave is 2 years, so over 10 years, the 10 years that we're looking at here, this would be a decline of 3.8 percentage points in the fraction in the population rating its health as excellent or very good. So certainly not improving health, and maybe a slight decline in health over this time period. The next thing we wanted to look at was the relationship between the probability of working, P65, and self-rated health. And this just shows the age-adjusted relationship. So how you read this is for males. If we look at the left bars, 1994 to 1998, I've aggregated here 3 waves to reduce noise. And the reference group is those who are in very good health. That's the missing bar. The leftmost bar are those who are in excellent health, and they have around 8 percentage points greater probability of working past age 65 than people whose health is very good. The rightmost light blue bar in those 5 are people who are in poor health, and they give an average subjective probability of about 20 percentage points less than people in very good health. So the difference between excellent and poor health in their anticipated working past age 65 is a number kind of approaching 30 percentage points. The average probability is a number like 30%, so more or less the people who are in poor health are giving very low single-digit probabilities of working past age 65. The noticeable thing about this, however, is the progression of the bars as we move from left to right. The rightmost bars are what we see in the waves 2010 to 2014, and there the difference has increased substantially more. The difference between those in very good health and those in poor health is now more than 30 percentage points compared to originally 20 percentage points. So that visually answers a question. The relationship between self-rated health and the subjective probability of working has increased. The sensitivity of P65 with respect to health increased gradually over time, as you can see here. Same for females, and the variation is substantially the same. To quantify the change in this variation with health, we did a regression of P65 on self-rated health wave number, so we have a linear change in P65, but importantly, the self-rated health interacted with wave number, and I'll first just show you the regression and then do some analysis of it. So the coefficients in boldface or dark are all significant at the 0.01 level. The ones grayed out are not, and you can see that high level of significance for many of the coefficients. But let's look at an extract of this. This shows wave number, self-rated health poor, and self-rated health poor interacted with wave number. So how you read the top line overall, wave number is basically time, and so the coefficient 1.8 means over 10 years of 10 waves, which is, or I should say 10 waves, that's 20 years. 10 HRS waves would be an increase of 18 percentage points in P65. That reflects the overall upward trend that we saw in P65. Self-rated health poor minus 14.6 for males means that people who rate their self as having poor health have reduced subjective probability of 15 percentage points compared to people in very good health. But the more interesting number, I think, is the interaction of minus 1.6. That means over 10 years of time, or 20 years of time, 10 waves of data, the self-rated health, people with self-rated health had a reduction in P65 of around 16%. So if you go from the beginning of the period to the end of the period, very large reduction in the probability of working past age 65 among those people with poor health. And you can see for fair health, a similar coefficient, slightly smaller, and people in good health also smaller. So the kind of progression that we saw in the raw bar charts is reflected in this regression. Okay, so that's a linear specification, but if you recall back to the P65 data, it increased for a while and then leveled out. So the linear specification doesn't capture that. So here's the same thing with a quadratic specification and now graphed over time for the 5 health groups. And what you see is, firstly, these are kind of all concave, reflecting the leveling out of P65 that we saw before, beginning in 2008. But hardly any gain for those in poor health. At the beginning of the period, around 6%, and at the end of the period, 7 or 8%. So those in poor health over time did not experience or did not state an increase in the probability of working past age 65, whereas those in better health stated much higher gains in the probability of working past age 65. An implication of that, which I'll come back to right at the end, is increasing disparity. This is an indication of increasing disparities along the health dimension. For women, more or less the same situation. Those in poor health, much smaller increases in P65 than those in better health. Well, what are the causes of this increased gradient? One possibility is the meaning of self-rated health. Self-rated health among epidemiologists and demographers and some economists also is kind of what we do when we're trying to measure health in an easy manner. It's asked in almost every survey there is worldwide. It's easy to ask, and it has high predictive power for mortality and other things. And but there's a question of the stability of this measure, and in particular, we know in age-related studies that there is a question of stability. You can see that by some measures of health, health declines substantially with age, but self-rated health doesn't seem to decline as much as it should, and it's speculated that self-rated health is with reference to either your past self or with people around you. And so if you're 80 and you're able to drive a car, then you think your health is excellent, but that would not be the same if you were age 40. So there is a question about that. What we're going to look at here is the meaning of self-rated health over time, holding age constant, that it will be a cohort study rather than an age study. And so what I've done here is to look firstly at a number of health indicators classified firstly in total and then by self-rated health. These are cohort studies. So let's look at the right bars, the total. There, the blue bar is the frequency of BMI of 35 and above, body mass index. And in 1992, among everyone aged 55 to 59, workers and non-workers, around 7.5% had BMI of 35 and above. By the time the rightmost bar, the yellow bar, that's 2010 to 2014, that number had risen to around 16%. This is known. What surprised me, possibly, did surprise me, is holding health constant. The increases are very substantial and maybe even larger. Look at, for example, the people in fair health. These were people in fair health who rated themselves in 1992 to 1996, age 55 to 59 in fair health. And some 13% had BMI of 35 and above. By 2010 to 2014, approaching 30% had BMI of 35 and above. And there are overlaps here. Somebody whose health is good in 2010 to 2014 had BMI averaging 20%. That's more than what people who rated themselves as fair health in 1992 to 1996. So within health categories, strongly increasing frequency of BMI over 35 over time. Diabetes, strongly associated with BMI over 35, and basically you see the same pattern. Even among those who state their health is excellent, 5% of them by 2010 to 2014 had diabetes, and you'd kind of wonder about your self-rating there. ADL limitations, the pattern is not quite as strong, but nonetheless, within health categories, more or less, you see an increase in ADL limitations. You also see, of course, a very strong relationship between self-rated health and ADL limitations. IADL limitations, I would say more or less the same pattern. Index of limitations on mobility, these are, do you have difficulty climbing a stairs? This is an index of these things taken, a number of them together, maybe less of a strong pattern there. And I won't show the graph. Similar upward trends for index of large muscle function, index of gross motor function, index of fine motor function. These are all things that are self-reported in the HRS, and you see similar patterns there. Cognition score, a slight decline overall in total and within each self-reported health category. This surprised me to see this. I was not aware of a decline in cognition score at these ages. Health limits work. This is the only one with a less obvious trend, although if you leave out the 1992 to 1996, then you kind of see an upward trend. So the bottom line of this, I would say, is that the meaning of self-rated health as indicated by more objective health measures. These are things like, can you climb a flight of stairs, or do you have problems getting in and out of bed and so on, show that within a health category, health is actually worsened. And so the meaning of self-reported health has changed over time. People in poor health are in worse health relative to people in excellent health than they used to be. Questioning the stability of that as a measure to be used over time, which is kind of bad news for people like me and many others in the room who like to use that. And it's, as I said, available and comparable across many surveys. An additional measure of possibly both of health and also of independent interest is the subjective probability of survival. It's asked in all HRS waves the chances of living to age 75 or age 85. And you can think of this in two ways, at least two ways. One is a health indicator. It's certainly strongly related to health. And secondly, an indicator of longevity, which may induce later retirement. And so we want to look at that. Here are average values of survival to age 75 among, again, the same population that we've been looking at, 55 to 59. A little bit hard to see here. There's a peak in this for the whole population around HRS wave 5, which is the year 2000, and since then, somewhat of a decline. If we do the same thing within self-reported health bands, first looking at the right three columns, decline in self-reported in subjective survival, clear in the entire population, and even also within age self-reported age band, self-reported health bands declines also, and for females a similar set of graphs. Quantifying the trend in subjective survival to age 75, do the same kind of regression. Here are the regression coefficients, and I won't really say anything about these. Instead, do the same quadratic and then just graph these. So here are the fitted values of P75, the subjective, the probability of survival to age 75 among males, 55 to 59. Self-rated health. The top blue line is for those who state their health as being excellent. Their stated probability peaks. Well, first you notice these are slightly concave, indicating or reflecting the downward turn that we saw before. Very large variation by self-rated health. Poor people have averages, people whose health is poor have averages around 35% percentage points, and those in excellent health approaching 80. But what you see in all of these is a slight downward slope following around wave 5, wave 6, 2000, 2002. So as measured by P75, certainly not an increase in health or life expected survival. Females, more or less the same pattern. So to summarize, the increase in actual labor force participation has, at least until now, seemingly ceased, that we had seen for many years going back. Really, the increase began in the late 1980s and continued more or less unabated until the Great Recession. But since then, very little evidence of a continued increase. The increase in the subjective probability of working has, again, up till now, ceased. It would be very interesting to see 2016 data from HRS, which is so far not available. And the variation in the subjective probability of working as a function of self-rated health has increased among the later cohorts, a widening of the difference in probability of working according to self-rated health. And those in worse health had little gain in subjective probability of working past age 65. The meaning of self-rated health seems to have changed as indicated by more objective measures of health. Those with fair or poor health in later cohorts have a greater number of objective health conditions. They have lower cognitive measures and ADL limitations, more ADL limitations and so on. An implication of this that I alluded to briefly is that the increased dispersion of projected retirement age by health status will exacerbate inequality in economic preparation for retirement. Those in poor health, we of course are not only in poor health, but they also have less financial resources. They will not take advantage of the delayed retirement that we heard about yesterday and the importance of delayed retirement as frequently as they did earlier in the 1990s because of this increased dispersion that we saw. And so we may well see greater inequality in economic preparation for retirement because of that. That's, I'll stop there.
Mike and Susann have been looking at P62 and P65 as a forecasting instrument. And the information that we've just gotten on the changes in health and changes in P62 and P65, I think are relevant to the general approach that they've taken in a number of papers. And I like the idea of using P62 and P65 to project, to help project, but I think it gets more complicated, especially given the new information that you've gotten now. They argued about the continuing flattening, that it portends a reduction in later labor force participation. And they find that the decline in health helps to explain the declining trend. What I want to do now is I want to think of this as its role as a more precise instrument. Their goal is to use this at P62 and P65 in forecasting models. And here, when they start to disaggregate the cohort differences in health, the cohort differences in P62 and P65, they find that objective health has declined, and that has weakened the gradient between self-reported health and expected labor force activity. And all of these issues are going to complicate using P62 and P65 when trying to project going forward. So let's look at some of the factors that are complicating. If you look first within an older cohort, in their earlier papers, what you find is they had to adjust. If you had labor force participation that was actually observed for the cohort on the left, and you've used P62 and P65 on the right, the predictions really weren't on enough that you could use that regression alone without adjusting it to try to forecast ahead. I think one of the reasons is, and I'll show you in a minute, P62 and P65 pertains to full-time work, whereas labor force participation includes partial retirement. So you don't get a direct correspondence between what you're trying to forecast and the variable that you're using. And the other thing is P62 and P65 occur a decade before the actual labor force participation. And a lot of covariates, the economic environment, things can change over that 10-year period. So even within a cohort, you have some adjustments that are really required. Then if you look among the cohorts, you're getting other changes, such as those that Mike has been talking about. And that may make it even harder to use results for an old cohort to project what's going to happen, taking P62 and P65, feeding it into a projection equation and using that to predict what's going to happen with the newer cohort. With health, the role of health changing in the complicated way that Mike has described within and between cohorts, that's going to make the forecasting job even more difficult. As you'll see, some of the covariates that were mentioned, not here, but in previous papers, really haven't formally been linked to the projection mechanism from P62, P65 to labor force participation. So what I have here is a simple set of flows. Each of the cells is simply a row percent. So what we have is status in 2006. For example, if we look at the first row, we have 58% continuing as not retired, which is working more than 1,500 hours. 9% partially retiring between 2006 and 2012, 22% completely retiring. And what Mike and Susann are using are the cells that are highlighted in yellow and the cells that are highlighted in red, which are those who have returned to not retirement status, that is to full-time work. But what they're trying to predict are the totals of the cells that are in the tan, which is the top two rows and the top two columns. So if the relation of partial retirement at all is changing relative to full retirement, that's also going to complicate what you're trying to predict, the fact that the two sets of measures don't correspond. What I want to look at, I want to take a series of our structural retirement models. I did some work with Tom Steinmeier in different settings. And first I want to look at the role of health. So we took one structural model where we took all of the health behaviors. We had them feed into diseases. We had those diseases feed into ADLs, IADLs, and we had that feed into labor force participation. And the model has full-time work, part-time work, and full retirement in it. And I want to use that to simulate the effects of health on retirement, so you can get this linkage between the health status and retirement outcomes. So just to summarize first, and then I'll look a little bit more in detail, eliminating all health problems would raise the retirement age by 1 year for the whole sample, averaging across healthy and unhealthy people. Smoking depresses full-time work of smokers by 3.5 percentage points in the early 60s and depresses any work by over 4 percentage points in the mid-60s. Mike mentioned diabetes. Diabetes seems not to have a major effect on retirements. If you eliminated it, it would reduce the retirement by only a week. And the coefficients in the structural model are measured for only one cohort. So, of course, going forward, you'd also have to allow for changes in these coefficients. So what this table shows is the probability, the percentage point increase in probability of working full-time and in working at all, the two measures. The right-hand side is the dependent variable that Mike's trying to predict, and the left-hand side is the full-time measure. And here we have it by age, and what you can see is that the impact of making everybody healthy on their retirement occurs at a younger age than the impact of making everybody healthy on the likelihood that they'd be working at all. There are other covariates. Mike and Susann mentioned them in their previous work, and I want to talk a little bit about their potential impact, and of course they may be correlated, as Mike noted, with health. So higher women's labor force participation, as we'll show you in a model, reduces husbands' labor force participation. Pessimism that Social Security benefits are going to be paid has people claiming earlier. We'll show you a different model. The trend from DB to DC plans is encouraging later retirement, and the Great Recession has also had some impact. So let's start with, this is based on a model where husbands and wives, two earner families, each make independent decisions, and they end up coordinating their decisions knowing that their behavior is going to affect the behavior of their spouse. So there's a game that's going on within the household. And what we find is, here we look at what if we eliminated any labor market activity of the wife? What happens to the labor market activity of the husband? So what you can see is up through age 61 that the increase in full-time work comes from both partial retirement, a reduction in partial retirement, and a reduction in full-time work. When you hit 62, eliminating the wife's labor force participation reduces the number, the percent fully retired, and it increases both partial retirement and full-time work, and the effects of the labor force participation of the spouse on retirement really can be quite large. We had mentioned yesterday, Courtney has pointed out with her co-authors that most models of retirement underpredict Social Security claiming age. And so what we did is we fit a model where we had retirement, claiming age, saving behavior, all at the same time. And the second dotted line, the one with the broader dots, is the actual data. The solid line is claiming behavior if the full Social Security benefit is being paid after we estimated the model. And then we resimulated on the assumption that people expect to get only half the benefit. Now, that's not going to be the whole story of underclaiming, but if in fact in one of these structural models you assume that people value Social Security at only half their amount, that's enough to explain away the gaps in the ability of these models to explain claiming behavior. Alicia Minnell and her colleagues, we have online at the Boston College Center the documented code for one of our models. She put it online and it's available for anybody that wants to use it. She's used it for a couple projects. And in this one, what she did is we estimated the model on the oldest HRS, the original cohort, and then she plugged in the DB, DC values for the early boomers and looked at the changes in retirement. And the switch from DB to DC plans affects the percent retiring early by a couple of percentage points for people between age 61 and age 64. And we did another model, this one was supported by Sloan, where we looked at what happens if you get the kind of interruption that you got out of the Great Recession, and then people have to re-optimize and also change their expectations. And you can see the biggest effects from the Great Recession were in 2009 and 10, especially for 55 to 59-year-olds. And here we use, again, the model of husbands and wives. So in the end, I think Mike and Susann do a very nice job of documenting these recent health changes. They're really interested in the changes in P62 and P65. And I like the idea of trying to take anticipated, certainly the life cycle model tells us it should work, anticipated probabilities of working full time and using that when trying to do projections. But this is really a complicated business. There are the adjustments in the original regression within cohort. There are further adjustments between cohorts. And these themselves are complicated. And then if you think about trying to bring in the changes in the relation of self-reported health to actual health within those regressions and how those are working, and then on top of it, bring in systematically the covariates that I talked about, all of which seem to have substantial effects on retirement, there is, I think this is good news for them, I think there's a considerable amount of work to be done before we can take these projected probabilities of working full time and using them for forecasting. Thanks.
This is just kind of a basic clarification question. You were using age bands, and you were looking at how the age bands move over time, and I'm sure that you did this, but I just want to double check. Like, are the ages consistent in those age bands over time? So it's not just that, like, you know, there's more 51-year-olds. I know you, but I didn't hear you say it, and so I just wanted to.
It's a cohort study holding age 55 to 59 constant.
So like age, there's not more like 55-year-olds in 2004 compared to 59-year-olds.
There is a slight change over time, a very slight change, and it has to do with the HRS refreshment sample. Slightly deficient on 55-year-olds every 6 years, but the differences are very slight.
So yeah, so the differences are so it's not just that each age band is getting younger over time, or
No,
each
no.
age band is changing over time.
Also, the regressions control for single years of age.
Okay, thank you.
We have a question over here. John Pencavel. Wait for the mic. Yeah. I have a question while the mic's coming. Have actual mortality rates, age-specific mortality rates in the 50s deteriorated? Or we just don't know yet?
As you probably know, last year life expectancy did not increase for the first time ever, practically. And then, of course, John is probably going to ask about the Case-Deaton connection. So go ahead.
Go ahead, John.
Well, I was just going to say, you must have linked this to the work of Ann Case and Angus Deaton, who found this remarkable change in mortality rates. Now, my memory suggests it was for late middle-aged people who 10 years later would be considering retirement. Also, what I remember from the Case Deaton work that I've read is that disaggregation was very important, that the opioid crisis was more evident in Appalachia, in parts of the Midwest, and it was more serious among white men. So I think that link might be interesting to look at.
Yeah. This is exactly the same age band. I've got this thing. The same age band. They were looking at people in the early 50s, which is exactly the same age group. This is, that work is important, but I think the general malaise spreads across many more identifiable groups than just the groups they looked at. You saw people in excellent health, their subjective survival did not increase over time. And so it's more widespread than that.